Okay, so thanks everyone, and thanks Marco. So my name is Aidan Lyon. I'm a philosopher at the Institute for Logic, Language and Computation here at UVA. And I'm also an external member of the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy at LMU in Munich. My background is in mostly philosophy of probability and statistics, but I'm trained in philosophy of science, and philosophical psychology, that kind of area. And so this talk is about psychedelic philosophy, which is potentially a new field of philosophy or a new way of doing philosophy, although I'm very aware of how grand that claim is. So one of the things I want to do in this talk is to kind of approach this idea that there may be a distinctive way of doing philosophy that's psychedelic in a very careful and kind of rigorous way. So this is based on the last substantial chapter of my book, Psychedelic Experience. In fact, I've been on a bit of a journey with APRA. So back in the day, about 2 years ago, my first talk with APRA was on chapter 2, what is psychedelic experience? Then a bit later, did another talk on attention. And then we were going to do one on creativity, but the COVID situation happened. And now we're on the last substantial chapter as I'm writing it up. So this is still a work in progress. Okay. So the outline of the talk is, first I'm going to give you guys a bit of a background on how I'm using the concept of psychedelic experience. It's a little bit different from what you may be familiar with. So I'm going to just lay that out clearly to make sure we're all on the same page there. Then in section 2, I'm just going to say a little bit about what philosophy is and how we go about doing it. And then the bulk of the talk is going to be about this distinction between what I call analytic methods and psychedelic methods. So in section 3, I'm going to briefly describe and give some examples of analytic methods. And then the real guts of the talk is going to be, all the action is going to be here on psychedelic methods. Okay, so off we go. So psychedelic, the word comes from the Greek terms psyche and delos, meaning mind or soul, and to make clear or to make visible. So that means a psychedelic experience is a mind-revealing experience. Now, in the book, I discuss this in more detail, but here I'm just going to kind of lay this out as a statement. A mind-revealing experience is an experience in which some part or aspect of your mind that is normally hidden from your awareness in the subconscious is brought into awareness. And so when we say a substance is a psychedelic, we imply that it has the property of reliably bringing about the mind-revealing experience when consumed. You can think about it as like when we call a substance a painkiller, we imply that it reliably has the property of bringing about pain relief. Or if we call a substance a hallucinogen, we're implying that it brings about hallucinations. So the same thing is true for so-called psychedelic substances. Okay, another important concept is one that you're probably not familiar with, which is what I call psychocryptic. It's the opposite of psychedelic. So the word psychocryptic comes from the term psyche, and this time kryptos, meaning mind or soul, and to conceal. So a psychocryptic experience is a mind concealing experience. It's the opposite of a psychedelic experience. And an important corresponding concept is a psychocryptic state. It's a mental state in which some of the mind is concealed from awareness. And so the fact that we sometimes have psychedelic experiences implies that we're normally stuck in psychocryptic states. So if you could have a psychedelic experience now, that means there's some part of your mind hidden from you now. So there's a sense in which you're in one of these psychocryptic states. Okay, so from these basic definitions, there's 4 key implications we need to keep in mind as we go through the talk. Some drugs that we call psychedelic may not be psychedelic. Okay, it's an empirical question whether or not a substance like LSD or psilocybin has this property of revealing the mind. It could have some other effect, and that other effect could be incredibly important, especially for therapeutic purposes, but it may not have anything to do with revealing the mind. This is a hypothesis that was put forward by Humphrey Osmond in 1957. And like any other hypothesis, it could be false. So we need to be open to that possibility. Another key implication is that some substances that are not typically thought as psychedelic may turn out to be psychedelic. So as some of you know, there are debates about whether or not, say, MDMA should count as a psychedelic. One argument against it is that it's not a serotonin agonist. On this way of thinking about it, it will be a psychedelic if it has this property of reliably bringing about mind-revealing experiences. And this concept is not tied to substances. So other interventions on the brain/mind that don't involve substance consumption may turn out to be psychedelic. And so one of the key such interventions for my book and for this talk is meditation. So it's an idea that's been around for a long time that certain kinds of meditation bring about certain kinds of insight experiences that are, in a sense, getting us access to larger or to parts of our mind that we're normally unable to access. So other things besides substances can be psychedelic. And some interventions may be more psychedelic than others, and they may also be psychedelic in different ways. So I have this funny quote from Henri Poincaré where he talks about drinking black coffee as having psychedelic effects on his mental state. Now, so we may reluctantly admit that then that maybe coffee can be a psychedelic, but then the thing that makes so-called psychedelic drugs so interesting is that they may be very psychedelic compared to coffee. So there's degrees in how psychedelic an experience can be. And then experiences may be psychedelic in different ways. So just as you can reveal something in different ways, you could reveal something with greater clarity or lesser clarity. These interventions could reveal the mind in different ways. Okay. So that's the setup. That's the background on this concept of psychedelic experience. Now we'll do the same for philosophy. So the word philosophy comes from philo and sophia, or sophos, meaning a love for or attraction to and wisdom. Put together, philosophy is the love for wisdom, or maybe a better way of translating the term is it's the process of being drawn to wisdom, kind of like how a moth is drawn to a flame, but with a better outcome, because wisdom is what you need to understand in order to live well. Philosophers have given different conceptions of wisdom, and I won't go into those here. We're just going to work with a very high-level, coarse-grained conception of wisdom. It's just what you need to know in order to live a good human life. And that's understood very broadly. So that's in terms of maintaining your physical health, having good relationships, being in good financial standing, and potentially, if it lines up with who you are, some course of spiritual development as well. So a very broad notion of living well here. So philosophy is in that business of understanding this thing called wisdom and kind of being attracted to it and fascinated by it and studying it, trying to understand it and figuring out how to live well. Okay, so as we were discussing before the talk began, science is also in the business of philosophy. So, but it specializes in particular aspects of wisdom and methods for attaining it. I'll go into this a little bit more detail in a moment. But if you think about, like, if wisdom is about living a good life, then part of living a good life involves knowing how the world works, right? And that's what science does. And of course, historically, science has gone by the name natural philosophy. There are also other kinds of philosophy. So this talk is mostly a project in analytic philosophy. There is, of course, also continental philosophy. And the main idea of this talk is that there's another kind called psychedelic philosophy. Okay, so how do we distinguish these kinds of philosophy? Well, the first thing to note is that there are no clear, like completely clear distinctions between these approaches to philosophy. There's a lot of overlap between analytic and continental, and there's also a lot of overlap between analytic and natural philosophy or science. You see this very clearly in areas like theoretical physics, where the region between or the line between philosophy of physics and theoretical physics was not clear at all. But nevertheless, there are useful distinctions to be made here. And one way to articulate them is in terms of the objects and methods of the kinds of philosophy. So for example, the distinctive objects of natural philosophy, i.e. science, are the truths of physical nature. And one of its distinctive methods is the hypothetical deductive model, where we put forward a hypothesis, deduce statements about how the empirical world will be, and we test against the world. The analytic continental philosophy distinction is often characterized by a different emphasis on methods of analysis and synthesis. But here, analysis is often understood in terms of, roughly speaking, like breaking things up into components, reducing them, and figuring out the relationships between those components. And synthesis is about drawing connections between things rather than breaking them down into their components. And there's also something of an emphasis on content, with continental philosophy tending towards the phenomenological, social, and political topics, and analytic philosophy somewhat covering those topics, but tending to focus more on issues to do with language, science, the mind, psychology, physics, these sorts of things. Okay, so there's an aspect of philosophy which is, you might say, is well-directed. It's about figuring things out that are external to you. But a lot of philosophical activity is figuring out kind of what's going on in the inside. And there's a famous passage by Socrates that really highlights this aspect of philosophy. So he's talking about, I take it everyone's familiar with the Socratic Method as this method of asking kind of difficult questions to tease out implicit beliefs that people have, and then finding like hidden connections or contradictions or inconsistencies in those implicit beliefs. So speaking of that method, which he calls his art of midwifery, he writes, he said, "My art of midwifery is in general like theirs, namely real midwives. The only difference is that my patients are men, not women." We have to excuse the sexism there. "And my concern is not with the body, but with the soul that is in travail of birth. And the highest point of my art is the power to prove by every test whether the offspring of a young man's thought is a false phantom or instinct with life and truth. The many admirable truths they bring to birth have been discovered by themselves from within, but the delivery is heaven's work and mine." Okay, so this is from very early on, we see that there's an aspect of philosophy that involves bringing something internal to the surface and articulating it and sharing it with others. Okay, so now let's jump into the analytic methods. So I've been struggling to find the correct word for these methods, by the way. It's not entirely clear to me that analytic is the best one, but it's the best one I've been able to think of so far. So roughly what these methods have in common is that they tend to be oriented towards language and expressed in language. They tend to have a priority for precision. They're rule-based. They involve conscious, slow, careful deliberation. So the quintessential class of such methods are those from logical deduction. First developed pretty much by Aristotle and described in his work called Analytics. So with logic, the concern is moving from true premises through a valid argument to a true conclusion and figuring out the rules for reliably doing so. There are other analytic methods. So the systems of probability, statistics, decision theory, and so on. Those are all analytic methods for pursuing wisdom. They're rules for managing risk or drawing inductive inferences or deciding in the face of uncertainty, right? All of those things are directed towards wisdom. We often maybe not think about it like that, but really that's what we're doing when we use these tools. Another class of methods that we can go into in detail in the question time if we want, conceptual analyses, explications, and engineering projects. At a high level, these are all different techniques for improving our concepts, which are the building blocks of our thinking. So, in the first section of this talk where I described what a psychedelic experience is and what a psychocryptic experience is, what I was doing there was an exercise in conceptual explication. I was making sure my concepts are precise so we can use them well in our thinking later on. Okay, and then another class of methods are what's called philosophical heuristics. These are where they're not rules that have the same kind of, they're not as constraining as the rules of logic, but they're still rules in the sense of like a rule of thumb. So a good example of a heuristic would be in chess, where you should castle early. Now, that's not a rule of chess, like in the strict sense that you need to do that all the time. And it doesn't even guarantee that you'll win, but it's a good heuristic to set you up for a strong position in chess, generally speaking. Okay, so in philosophy and sciences, there are these heuristics. There are rules that describe reliable patterns of thought. So here's an example of one by Bertrand Russell, which will, I'm going to go into some detail because it's going to provide us a useful contrast to get started with the psychedelic methods in the next section. Okay, so in the passage I'm about to read, Russell is concerned with what's called thinking in ethically general terms. So when we're deciding public policy or thinking about theories of ethical systems, there's this issue of we fall into the trap of thinking in terms of our own groups that we identify with. So in the Western world or with our gender or something like that, it's hard for us to break free of the kind of preconceptions that come along with the groups that we identify with. So here's his kind of advice for breaking free of that. When in a sentence expressing political opinion, there are words that arouse powerful but different emotions in different readers. Try replacing them by the symbols A, B, C, and so on, and forgetting the particular significance of the symbols. So suppose A is England, B is Germany, and C is Russia. So long as you remember what the letters mean, most of the things you will believe will depend upon whether you are English, German, or Russian, which is logically irrelevant. When in elementary algebra you do problems about A, B, and C going up a mountain, you have no emotional interest in the gentleman concerned. Again, there's a bit of sexism there, we'll just have to pass over. And you do your best to work out the solution with impersonal correctness. But if you thought A was yourself, B was your hated rival, and C the schoolmaster who set the problem, your calculations would go askew, and you would be sure to find that A was first and C was last. In thinking about political problems, this kind of emotional bias is bound to be present, and only care and practice can enable you to think as objectively as you do in an algebraic problem. Okay. So you see the idea here. It's abstract away from the particulars that may be creating the emotional biases or triggering them, and then reason in that at that abstract level to develop your public policy or theory of ethics or what have you. Okay, so that's it for the analytic methods. We went through some examples and we saw that last example of a heuristic. We're going to come back to that in a moment. Okay, so now time for psychedelic methods. I think a good way to see what psychedelic methods are by drawing a contrast with analytic methods. And a good analogy to do this is in terms of thinking of CPUs and GPUs. CPU is a central processing unit and a GPU is a graphical processing unit. We have them in our computers, or most modern computers have both of these chips now. And a CPU is optimized for serial tasks and a GPU is optimized for parallel tasks. So the kind of regular like light processing tasks that you do on your computer, like typing in Microsoft Word or whatever, that tends to be CPU tasks. Everything's processed sequentially. But if you were to play an intense video game or you were to work with machine learning or neural network algorithms, you would be tapping into your GPU. The processes can be run in parallel. And for some kinds of tasks, that's much faster and a better way to perform the calculations. So we can roughly think of this analogy in terms of conscious thinking and unconscious thinking. When we're doing our conscious thinking and using our the analytic methods, they're taking advantage of what you can think of it as our philosophical CPUs. That's when we're doing those logical deductions and carefully, in a very controlled way, figuring out how to move from true premise to true conclusion. With the psychedelic methods, they're taking advantage of our GPUs. So they're tapping into this other way of thinking that we have. So this is not quite the system 1, system 2 distinction that a lot of you will probably be familiar with. I think a way to think about this distinction here is that the psychedelic methods are a way of creating novel integrations between system 1 and system 2 thinking. But the distinction here is closely related. So with both kinds of methods, there are advantages and disadvantages. The advantages with analytic methods is that they're tightly bound to our central executive systems. That means is you've got a lot of control over them, and they're very careful and rigorous. That's the nice thing about them. The downside is that they're very inefficient. They take a lot of work, they're slow, and we're not machine-like, so it's easy to make mistakes. On the psychedelic methods, they're going to be vastly more powerful, is going to be the argument. But the downside is that they're going to be much more independent of our executive control. So why there is this, like kind of, roughly speaking, faster, better way of doing philosophy, it's potentially much more unwieldy. And so what I'm arguing for in this talk is not that we should only do psychedelic methods, but really that the best philosophy would involve an integration between analytic and psychedelic methods. We need both of these things working together in tandem. Okay, and so the need for psychedelic philosophy is that in analytic philosophy and science, our thinking is dominated with analytic methods. This is what we get taught. This is what we practice day in, day out. And it seems like we're sort of just wasting our GPUs. We're not taking full advantage of them. This is an idea that's been around for a while. So for example, this is Abraham Maslow, who wrote, "Our conscious intellect is too exclusively analytic, rational, numerical, atomistic, conceptual, and so it misses a great deal of reality, especially within ourselves." So this is the idea. The psychedelic methods are going to allow us to see more of reality and more of what's going on inside us. Okay, so remember Russell, we had this idea of emotional bias. He described this method for avoiding it by thinking abstractly. Well, it turns out he goes on and describes another way. Thinking in abstract terms is, of course, not the only way to achieve ethical generality. It can be achieved as well, or perhaps even better, if you can feel generalized emotions. But for most people, this is difficult. If you are hungry, you will make great exertions if necessary to get food. If your children are hungry, you may feel an even greater urgency. If a friend is starving, you will probably exert yourself to relieve his distress. But if you hear that some millions of Indians or Chinese are in danger of death from malnutrition, the problem is so vast and so distant that unless you have some official responsibility, you probably soon forget all about it. Nevertheless, if you have the emotional capacity to feel distant evils acutely, you can achieve ethical generality through feeling. If you have not this rather rare gift, the habit of viewing practical problems abstractly as well as concretely is the best available substitute. So there's several key ideas here. One is that there's this idea of feeling generalized emotions. This is another way to think with ethical generality. There's this idea that as soon as you become aware of the plight of others distant from you, you'll soon forget about it. So that would be a psychocryptic experience. That stuff, you're aware of it, but it just falls away from awareness, and for some reason it doesn't come back. And the other key idea here is that this ability to feel this emotional capacity in a general way is really rare and hard for people to do. So if we put all this in a diagram to kind of simplify it all, we've got this philosophical objective to be able to think with ethical generality. And Russell described this heuristic of thinking in abstract terms, which is a way of taking advantage of our philosophical GPU to achieve that task. And then he describes this other way of doing it, feel generalized emotions, which he says is a rare ability for people and a difficult one. But then he leaves it at that. He doesn't tell us any way of like, is there a way to cultivate this ability? And of course, for those of you who are familiar with different meditative practices, there are practices of meditation that do exactly this. The practicing loving kindness meditation and compassion meditation are two techniques for developing this ability. Okay, so we can think of these methods as tapping into our philosophical GPU to cultivate this ability to feel generalized emotions and to achieve the same outcome that could be achieved via thinking in abstract terms using the analytic method, but in a sense more efficiently. And of course, anyone who's familiar with psychedelic, the experiences created by psychedelic substances, a very common report from people is they feel this intense connection with every human being on the planet, or even in time, including other kinds of sentient beings, like animals and plants. And so these are different methods for cultivating this ability, which would lead to this outcome. So these are what I call psychedelic methods for that reason. Okay, so that's one big example. Here's another big example. So I think a lot of you are probably familiar with Cartesian skepticism. This is the famous saying that came from Descartes, "I think, therefore I am." His project wasn't to doubt everything and just to arrive at that conclusion. What he was seeking out was a foundation for all scientific knowledge. And his method for doing that was to systematically figure out which of his beliefs he could doubt. And if it could be doubted, then it couldn't be part of the foundation of scientific knowledge. It wouldn't count as knowledge. It would just be a belief that might be true, but not definitely true. And so he wrote the meditations and with all these careful and elaborate arguments, kind of working through that process and arriving at that minimal conclusion that all he really knew was that he thinks. Now, at the time, one criticism of this project was that he could have done it in a simpler way. He could have just said, "I'm going to doubt all of my previous knowledge and then figure out what's true." In response to this, Descartes wrote, "You say that you approve of my project for freeing my mind from preconceived opinions. And indeed, no one can pretend that such a project should not be approved of. But you would have preferred me to have carried out by making a simple and brief statement, that is only in a perfunctory fashion. That is, just say, I'm going to doubt all my knowledge and then figure out what happens. But is it really so easy to free ourselves from all the errors which we have soaked up since our infancy? And can we really be too careful in carrying out a project which everyone agrees should be performed?" So here's Descartes replying to his critics, arguing for putting a lot of work into using this method of systematic doubt, putting a heavy workload on our philosophical GPU. Okay, so anyone who's ever taken a psychedelic knows that this is a very fast way to figure out that a lot of what you think you know, you don't actually know. It's a very, very common report, but here's a fun one that came out in 2019 from Mike Tyson, talking about his experience with 5-MeO-DMT. When you think you know everything and then realize you don't know anything, it's a big awakening. You can call it growth or you can call it a divine intervention. His experience of 5-MeO, you should listen to the rest of the interview, it's very interesting. But his experience with 5-MeO-DMT like broke through a lot of the kind of cognitive delusions that he had and showed him that he really doesn't know anything, and there's a kind of epistemic humility that one should have. So here's another way of arriving at the same result: consume a psychedelic. This would be a way of tapping into your philosophical GPU. In fact, there's a sense in which in this example, the philosophical GPU would have been a better way to do it. So as we know, Descartes ended up at this minimal foundation, I think, therefore I am. But those who are familiar with psychedelics know that they reliably cause this condition of ego dissolution, where we have this experience that there's no I or no self in the usual sense of I or self. And it turns out historically, this has been a criticism of Descartes. So Pierre Gassendi said that Descartes wasn't licensed to arrive at this conclusion that I think. What he should have just said is it thinks. You know, like how we talk about it rains. It's like there's thinking going on. And indeed, later on, Nietzsche went even further. He said that even thinks should be doubted because it comes along with its own preconceptions that could be questioned and that we should be uncertain of. So there's a sense in which Descartes, with his using his philosophical CPU method, didn't go far enough. He was trying to break free of his preconceptions, but there was just one last preconception, or two last preconceptions that he couldn't get out of. If he'd just taken a psychedelic, he may have been able to get that final step. Okay, so we can talk about that in terms of psychedelics. That's obviously a method for doing this, but of course, the history of Buddhism has been pointing in the same direction. So here's this idea of Zen doubt, expressed by the monk Hakuin Ekaku. At the bottom of great doubt lies great awakening. If you doubt fully, you will awaken fully. And here, awaken is Satori in the Zen tradition, which, strictly speaking, I guess is ineffable, but is a kind of insight into the self. Some Buddhists will interpret this as the insight that there is no self. We don't need to take a stand on that, but there's something clearly involving the self here. So Descartes' mission was to apply this method of systematic doubt to find a foundation of knowledge. And this is something that Buddhists have been doing, but in a completely different form. So I think this is an interesting case where the philosophical GPU outperforms the CPU, right? Taking psychedelics or meditation would be a better way of figuring out which things we're actually uncertain of. Okay, so the two examples given so far are kind of big examples. There's the ethical generality one from Bertrand Russell, and there's the Cartesian Skepticism from Descartes. The next point I want to make is that these psychedelic methods can help with philosophy on a smaller scale. It doesn't always have to be big, like big topic issues. I think there are other ones we could talk about. Like I think there are ones about like the hard problem of consciousness or metaphysical monism, but I won't go into those here. I want to show that I want to make the case that these methods can help us on more of the kind of day-to-day basis on our philosophical activity. And that includes scientific activity. So here's a quote that describes the kind of mental processes that meditation is helping us undo. So when we're looking at an object, the senses perceive the object, which then the mental consciousness instantly conceptualizes in a manner conditioned by all of our past experience. It superimposes this conceptualized version back onto the originally neutral data of our senses. All of this occurring so fast that we don't even notice the process, and are only left in the end with the mind's conceptual versions of things we take to be reality. Here's another similar description. Such spontaneous or automatic inferences, which the subject cannot help make, taking via presuppositions he is unaware of relying upon to conclusions he finds intuitively compelling, regardless of what warrant he has for them. Okay, so these two quotes are from two very different books. The first one is from the Ninth Karmapa's Ocean of Definitive Meaning. And the second one is from this book by Fisher on the philosophical delusion and its therapy, a project in analytic philosophy. So, and although the first one is 2011, it's just a 2011 translation, it's a very old book. They seem like worlds apart, but the point here is that they're actually the same thing. The processes that are affecting how we experience the world that Buddhists and other meditative traditions have been onto for so long, those things manifest in our philosophical scientific activity as well. So here are some specific ways in which this can happen. So by creating more separation between our thoughts and slowing our thought processes down, meditation can help reduce our reactions to arguments or ideas that are too fast or shallow. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this all the time. There are just people who just react too quickly to something that they disagree with, and they don't sit with it long enough to see what truths that might be in there. A lot of philosophical activity is about drawing distinctions, and meditation can help us see when novel distinctions need to be introduced. Again, this is the speed issue. The reason why distinctions need to be introduced is because the way people are thinking, it's too quick, and they're conflating things that they're not meant to be, that they should be distinguishing. So a lot of philosophical activity is that. It makes a lot of sense that meditation would help with that process. Meditation can also help increase our philosophical flexibility and open-mindedness. I think we're all guilty of this. We get trapped into our own views, and we get stuck seeing the world, the evidence, or the arguments through our particular positions. Meditation can, by changing our habits of thought, can break up that rigidness and give us more flexibility and open-mindedness. There's research from the scientific literature on creative problem solving that shows that meditation can help promote insight-based solutions to creative problems. A lot of philosophy is just creative problem solving, a particular kind. So there's every reason to expect those results are going to carry over to philosophical problems. And for those of you who know, I've got this concept of psychedelic space, which involves more scope, clarity, duration, and novelty. The idea here is that meditation helps us hold kind of like a richer set of ideas in our minds in one at a given moment, and to be able to think and reason through and see ideas in that state. Okay, so we can now imagine what a list of psychedelic methods might look like. Clearly involves meditation, the different kinds, short sessions, long sessions, retreats, and so on. Different kinds of psychedelics, small doses, large doses, microdoses. But there are other methods as well, which I'm not going into here. Methods like yoga, dance, sensory deprivation, the use of scent, sleep, both in terms of getting enough of it, but also using dreams and the process of waking up and falling asleep, fasting, and many more combinations of all of these methods above. Okay, so you might be looking at this and thinking, okay, one thing that binds all these methods together is that they're in a sense physiological. They all involve a substantial change to one's physiology, consuming a substance, not consuming a substance. Even meditation is like that. For the rest of the talk, I'm just going to go through two quick examples to show that this is not a necessary feature of psychedelic methods. So the first one is myth, or engaging with myth. Scholars of myth have long wondered about like what's the role of myth, and there are many roles of myth, but I think Jung captured a key insight about myth when he wrote, "The primitive mentality does not invent myths, it experiences them. Myths are original revelations of preconscious psyche, involuntary statements about unconscious psychic happenings, and anything but allegories of physical processes." So the idea here is that by engaging with a myth, we're tapping into knowledge or structures in our subconscious that would be difficult to arrive at otherwise. And for those, some of you probably know, like contemporary philosophy doesn't really engage with myth, but if you look at ancient philosophy, especially Plato's dialogues, it's riddled with myth. There's myth all the way through the dialogues. And so the thought here is that this is a philosophical method for tapping into kind of hidden knowledge or opening up spaces of thinking that allow us to access truths that would be harder to do otherwise. I think I've got enough time to do this. A good example would be the Sirens of Ulysses. This, very briefly, the story is Ulysses knows that they're heading into this difficult territory, whether they're going to be the sirens that sing these songs to put him into a trance, and that would lead the ship to the shore and kill everyone. So the story is Ulysses tells his sailors to fill their ears with soft wax, but he wants to hear the songs, so he gets them to tie him to the mast and promise that no matter what he says to them, they do not let him down. Okay, so the idea, one idea here is that this is a way of exploring this idea of a psychocryptic state. So Ulysses, he knows he's going into this state. He knows he's going to be kind of cut off from his better judgment for a period. And so he takes precautions in the moment while he has that clarity to protect himself from his future self. By engaging with that myth and kind of really living it, that's a way to understand this idea. And it happens all the time in our lives. When we get hungry or tired or whatever, these are all psychocryptic states that we naturally enter into every day, every week, and so on. Okay. And as Aristotle famously said, even the lover of myth, the philomythos, is in a sense a lover of wisdom, philosophos. Okay, one last method that's I want to discuss. It's not physiological, but it's another one. It's called aesthetic experience. So by engaging with aesthetic experiences, this is another way to tap into our philosophical GPUs. Philosophers have different theories about what aesthetic experience is, but a common thought is that it's a way of paying attention, aesthetic attention. So when we engage with aesthetic experience, we attend to an object or a scene's properties that are not in terms of their utility for something else. It's just appreciating them for their own selves. This process disrupts our usual flows of attention in a very similar way to how meditation and psychedelics do. Our normal life kind of grabs our attention towards things that are for purposes, for our utilities. And this is the way to escape our daily life and to free up attentional resource. Now that attentional resource could then just randomly float to something else in our minds in the way that it does with open monitoring meditation. Or the interesting thing about aesthetic experience is that we can design them. We can design things with aesthetic properties to guide our attention, to capture our attention from our daily lives, and then direct it toward the key theme or idea that we want to see explored. Of course, religions have been into this for a really long time. Okay, so to wrap up, I think an important point here is that one method is not better than another. What we need is a sort of a symbiotic combination of such methods. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. To understand how we can get into these psychocryptic states, here's something that you might do. Read intently the Sirens of Ulysses and immerse yourself in that story. Then engage with an artwork representing that myth, perhaps during a psychedelic trip. Study Aristotle on incontinence and practical wisdom and think about his insights. Then meditate with this instilled mindset, and then learn the science of working memory, decision making, etc. That package is a much better way of understanding the phenomenon than just focusing on what you might do using analytic methods, which would be study Aristotle and learn the science. Okay, final point. I've been focused on the methods, but there's an interesting question. Does psychedelic philosophy have its own distinctive objects? I've been doing analytic philosophy for about 15 years now. No one's ever said anything about enlightenment or self-transcendence or anything like that. No one's ever said you could follow deductive arguments and then become enlightened. Lots of great things can happen, but it's not really at the forefront of the branding and marketing strategy of analytic philosophy. But of course, this is a big part of Buddhist and other meditative philosophies. And it seems like these are an important part of living well in that general sense. So perhaps there are some outcomes that psychedelic philosophy can achieve that analytic philosophy cannot achieve, or for which it's ill-suited for achieving. Okay, so to wrap up, there are different methods for bringing about psychedelic experiences and to escape psychocryptic states. These can be used to harness the power of our philosophical GPUs. This isn't quite the usual system 1, system 2 distinction. Rather, these methods allow for novel integrations of the two systems of thinking. Much of philosophical activity, and remember I include scientific activity here, is dominated by analytic methods. And so the main idea here is that by integrating psychedelic methods into our philosophical activity, we can become better philosophers, wiser individuals, and live better lives. Thanks for listening.
All right. Thank you very much, Aidan, for the presentation. Also great timing. I think it would have been fine if it was longer. I'm sorry, I didn't want to like put a strict constraint on you. We're used to, papers and then very dense. So then, but this one could have, you did. Sorry. But I guess if anyone has any questions, now would be the right time. So please just take the, please just ask any questions. Maybe, can you stop?
Hi, I'll ask a question.
Yeah, Aidan, can you stop sharing the screen if you can?
Oh,
so we can go back to the.
Sure, I will do that.
Gallery view. Yeah. There we go. All right, go ahead.
Hi, and thanks, Aidan, for the really interesting talk. I guess a question about I guess one thing that was coming to mind was, as you were discussing the ways in which people in wisdom traditions like Buddhism and people in the Western philosophical canon had come to the same types of conclusions. And one of the ones that's often noted is like Hume arriving at the view that the self is nothing but, say, a bundle of experiences, that there is no substantive ego, and the same insight being arrived at by meditators in, say, the Buddhist tradition. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, right, arriving at that insight is one thing. That's just conceptual, right? And it's something that you can gain from, say, reading some sutras and being convinced by some arguments, or for that matter, reading Hume. But the project of meditation and presumably the relevant sorts of psychedelic experiences that you might have there is deeply connected not just to having that same insight, but transforming it in a way and integrating it in a way into yourself, so that seems to go well beyond the scope of anything that a discursive argument could do, right? So I guess this, ties in with, maybe, is that just another way of saying what you were saying at the end of the talk?
Yeah, exactly. So another, like a good example is Hume on inductive arguments. So at the end of this long discussion of the fact that they can't be justified, he says that, well, nevertheless, we still have the habit of making them. So there's something about us that doesn't, you could arrive at these philosophical conclusions, but they don't get internalized in a way. There's a kind of a duality inside you if you buy into the conclusions. And these other methods seem to allow you to integrate them into your way of being or system of believing in a way that the analytic methods can't do.
So I wonder if it runs the other way around too, right? So that there are cases where, through having psychedelic experiences or engaging with psychedelic methods, the other distinction that came to mind as you were talking for me was the difference that philosophers of science talk about with respect to the context of discovery and the context of justification.
Yeah.
Analytic methods seem to belong really, really firmly in the context of justification. Do you think that psychedelic methods are exclusively like context of discovery, like this is a way to have insights, and then you can bring them back to your analytic philosophical work or your scientific work, and now look for rigorous argument that connects it up with true premises or things like that? Is that distinction a valuable one for thinking here too?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it is telling that so much work in philosophy of science is on justification and not of discovery. Of course, there are analytic methods of discovery, right? So there are like algorithms for pattern detection, for example. But yeah, I hadn't thought about this, but yeah, maybe if you're working from the perspective of these analytic methods, then justification is going to be an easier problem to work on than discovery. And maybe it's flipped around in the case of psychedelic, that the problem of discovery is an easier problem to work on than the problem of justification. In fact, you kind of see that all the time, right? Like people come out of these trips and they have these insights and they're really convinced of them, but they have a hard time explaining why they're true. So yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that.
I mean, sometimes they're not, though, right? Like that's also but the analytic kind of part can be useful for afterwards, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. That's why I really want to be careful to make it really clear that it's the two kinds of methods is crucial. It's that integration. I see the analytic methods as keeping the psychedelic ones in check. Psychedelic ones are great at getting insights, but of course there are false insights. And even worse than that is that we can have false insights with such confidence. It can be really misleading. So we really need to be disciplined to keep those insights in check with the analytic methods.
Yeah, I guess, sorry, just continuing on this one, because I think you pointed out a very interesting thing. This apparently like kind of contradictory aspect of psychedelics, right? Of the ability to, so I guess I would like to know what you think about it. The ability both to make people doubt everything that they know very fundamentally, but also to like give a very strong sense of certainty on the other
Yeah.
end. So that this kind of like have this paradoxical, yeah. How do you see, how do you think that fits in this context? Because I think you talked more about the doubting part, right?
Yeah.
How do you think the certainty part arises?
Yeah.
If it makes sense in this.
Yeah, it's tricky. So, so one example that I wanted to include, but I didn't have time, was William James's experiences with nitrous oxide, where he became he famously convinced of Hegel's absolute idealism. Right? So he came from this perspective of pragmatism and spending a lot of time criticizing Hegel, and then in this experience suddenly flipped around and became convinced of the opposite. So there's definitely that certainty aspect, and it's not clear. It's hard to know what to do with that. So I think first thing is definitely as like kind of a piece of advice for thinking. If you do come out of these experiences with an insight that you're very certain of, maybe put even extra work into criticizing it and you know, putting it up for scrutiny, checking it against the evidence, giving talks, you know, to check it against other people. But there is something strange going on, especially when it comes to mystical experience, because a lot of descriptions of the pathway to mystical experience involves going through uncertainty. So there's that Zen notion of the great doubt. Or in the Christian mystics, the cloud of unknowing. There's a lot of mystics have been on this idea of that what they're looking for is in this kind of pure uncertainty and leaning into that. But then when you look at a lot of the descriptions of mystical experiences, it's nothing but certainty of this noetic quality and this insight into the true metaphysical nature of reality. And so, yeah, I don't know what to make of that, but there is this weird contradiction there, this uncertainty and strong certainty at the same time.
And maybe this doubt kind of creates a vacuum that if you have a need for control and certainty, that your mind just fills it up with the next thing that comes along.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course there's also the meta thing too, right? Like you can be certain that that you should be doubting all these things that you didn't doubt before. Like I think the Mike Tyson example is like this. The larger story is that he had this ego wrapped up in his like fighting identity, and he knew like how things worked, and it was all blown up. And it wasn't just it was all blown up and like, oh, I don't know anything anymore, but maybe I do. It was no like complete certainty that I didn't know what I thought I knew.
I think Cindy has a question, or at least there's a raised hand.
Yeah, hi. So I think I want to move the goalpost a little bit in a way that's a little bit more clear and a little bit more palatable for philosophers, I would say. So you were saying like at the end, the goalpost is achieving things like enlightenment, whereas philosophers talk about reaching certain external truths. I think actually a little bit more clear of a goalpost would be achieving a certain kind of freedom, a transformational freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about things like,
I'm reminding you.
This is my Alexa.
Say my affirmations.
When you talk about things like enlighten, it says it twice.
I'm reminding you. Say my affirmations.
Okay, stop, Alexa. Stop. Thank you, Alexa. So when you talk about things like, hey, the goal is to achieve enlightenment, and that's how we're going to achieve wisdom. And that's, for philosophers, you know, enlightenment is, and for a lot of people, enlightenment is this high in the pie in the sky, really hard to reach, really difficult, something that's sort of almost impossible. Maybe like a very few people have ever really achieved enlightenment. And we're like the Dalai Lama, Jesus, right? So that's not very palatable for a lot of philosophers to say, hey, that's the goalpost. But when you want to, but what you do get from taking psychedelics is you gain some sort of transformational freedom. And I like your concept about psychic cryptic states, because that's what you're achieving, sort of a transformational freedom from. We have a lot of beliefs, we have a lot of things that we believe unconsciously. And those unconscious beliefs are, if you take a theory of action, beliefs, desires, and then you do some sort of action based on your beliefs and desires, right? So if we have a lot of unconscious beliefs, then there's a lot of actions that we do on the basis of those beliefs. But if we revealed what they were, so here's an example. People have a belief that life is about scarcity, life is about competition, right? So during the pandemic, you see people on the news fighting for the last toilet paper roll or rolls of toilet paper, right? And why were they fighting for the last rolls of toilet paper? Because they have this belief that life is about competition, life is about scarcity. And maybe if that belief at the bottom was doubted or revealed, or in some sort of way, you know, we thought about it more, then we would take away a lot of beliefs that we have that are harmful to us in some sort of way. So I really like to think about, you know, Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm.
And I love this example. You know, Grimoire Wormtongue?
No, I don't.
He was the advisor that kept speaking false lies to the king. And then that wizard, he comes in, and he's like, and he says, he does a spell and the king transforms. He doesn't believe, like, Grimwald, the advisor, was saying all these things into his ear, and then suddenly he becomes really healthy again. Do you remember that scene?
I don't, but maybe can I respond to the earlier points? Because there's a lot there already.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with you that concepts like enlightenment are not all that palatable for analytic philosophers. That's why it was towards the end, because I wanted to highlight that a lot of these methods can be directed towards the traditional targets of analytic philosophy. But whereas, say, science has its distinctive targets that are different from the targets of, let's say, continental philosophy, I want to think about the possibility that psychedelic philosophy may also have its own distinctive targets. I think you're right that, like, a lot of our philosophical beliefs are driven by the subconscious beliefs that we have, and also desires, I think, and traumas. And so that was the point about the book on philosophical delusions. So a lot of, when you look carefully at a lot of people's philosophies, they really seem to be driven by that person's individual's life experiences or beliefs and so on. And so I think these methods are a way of revealing that to ourselves, which would be really difficult to do otherwise. And so it would open us to to a kind of a greater flexibility in our positions and thinking.
Do you want to Cindy, do you have any follow-up?
Do I have anything else to say? Okay, so I mean, yeah, basically you agreed with me. And so how would you change your ending then? Would you, because you said if we engage in psychedelic philosophy, we would lead better lives. But I would change that because it's in one way more palatable, but in another way more ambitious to achieving a sort of kind of transformational freedom. That's also very personal, right? So you're analytic philosophy is we're trying to achieve conclusions that changes other people's beliefs and maybe creates changes in the world in some sort of way. But it seems like the goal of psychedelic philosophy is to achieve some sort of personal transformation.
Not necessarily, because I think, so the example of myth, I think, is a good example where it could be a more effective way of communicating an idea you have with other people, rather than laying out some some really detailed argument. So if you read Aristotle and Incontinence, and then you read the Homer's Odyssey, like clearly one stands out. Like it's easier to remember. Everyone knows about Ulysses and the Sirens. Very few people know about Aristotle's thoughts on incontinence. I think there's a reason for that. It's a more effective way of sharing ideas that you may have had with others.
All right. Do we have any other questions?
Maybe I would like to just thank Aidan for the presentation, because it was super fascinating and I'm so excited. I'm all sweating with excitement. So I'm not sure if I want to ask a question. Well, I guess maybe just in response to Cindy and you, Aidan, as well, maybe the distinction between individual transformation and like collective sort of transformation is also not that strict, and maybe that's also interwoven. Maybe the way to change the world is not only by being able to sort of convey objective, deductive truths, but there's also, yeah, many different ways in which we can influence our surroundings, which maybe, yeah, psychedelic philosophy could be a part in, could take part in. And one other fun fact I wanted to say is that the two books you showed us from Trengu and Fisher,
yeah,
which you said were really different, but I noticed that they're both published in 2011, which is for the astrology geeks amongst us, is like when the age of Aquarius started, which is basically an age where there would be way more sensitivity and greater awareness amongst humanity. So I thought it was quite a fun,
oh, wow.
a fun fact. Yeah.
I didn't know that. Yeah, on the first point, I completely agree. I think I mean, this is the point that various people have made, that there's a natural tendency that when we want to improve the world, we focus on the world, but a better way is to often to focus on improving ourselves first. And there's it's easy to underappreciate how effective that is at trying to make the world a better place. It can seem, when you describe it like that way, it can seem like a selfish endeavor. You're just going to focus on making yourself better, but there are these ways that we don't appreciate, in which those improvements to ourselves will kind of ripple out and affect others in all sorts of untold ways every day, through our daily lives.
Yeah, so I'd like to follow up on that. I think sometimes like you have to, in order to like even want to change the world, you have to change yourself and be able to like feel, the struggles of other people. Like the racial justice movement is a good example of this, I think. I think, if it were not for my own personal psychedelic experiences, I probably would not give a shit about the racial justice movement, in the US and around the world. But, because, of the ability of psychedelic experiences, not just, I mean, I also meditate, I used to meditate, I do yoga. The psychedelic experiences to like increase sensitivity to these things, like then that can actually provide like motivation to go change the world that wouldn't have been there before.
Yeah. And of course, the environmentalist movement is traced back to is often attributed to the awakening of the 60s. And I like this idea from in the entrepreneurial community that the best thing about becoming a millionaire is becoming the person who can make $1 million. It's not the money, it's the internal change that's required to make the money.
I've read about an observation that in general, Western philosophy tends to be geared towards truth seeking, and Eastern philosophy more towards way seeking. So I thought this also could apply to this. It's like giving up on the idea of finding some static truths and just finding out like which way, how can I live my life to, yeah, for example, to embody truth, or and I also think this you could relate this to process ontology. I think if psychedelics can open your mind more to all the interconnection of all events, instead of looking at things statically, there's more shifts of perspective to how things are connected.
Yeah, definitely. Another thing that I caught just for the sake of time was I have all this content on the Tao Te Ching, where when you look at, I think it's chapter 71, the discussion of ignorance and wisdom is exactly what we see in Socrates. But of course, the whole thing about the Tao is it's the way. So it's a focus on a process rather than an outcome. But you also see that in Socrates. So the main thing was his way of life. It wasn't really so much about like trying to refute someone or to figure something out. It was this kind of continual process of looking after your soul was the key thing. But that seems to have changed over the centuries. It's become more outcome oriented.
I also wanted to add a modality for engaging in psychedelic philosophy other than you listed, visualization.
Oh yeah.
So, you know, talking about entrepreneurs, there's like a big kind of movement within entrepreneurs about using visualizations to achieve your goals. So you get that from like Wallace Wattles, Science of Getting Rich, Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich. And it seems visualization is a very non-serial way of thinking, but you're processing information like in the GPU sort of framework. So that might be an interesting thing to look into. And
yeah, definitely. And you know, wasn't the study on Olympic skiers that those who visualized the course before they actually did it would systematically outperform those who didn't? So you can think of it as that process of visualization as a way of like activating the knowledge that they already have to make it more accessible when they're actually running the course.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of studies. There's one on people who visualized playing the piano who didn't know how to play the piano, and they were able to create all these synapses in their brain where they learned how to play the piano. There's another one about dancing. People who visualized being able to dance became better dancer in a short amount of time. There's one about students who visualized taking a test and then visualized the obstacles of them not getting an A. And they did a control group, and the group of students who didn't do the visualization exercise got statistically lower scores.
Yeah, I definitely think that's another way to do it. That, yeah, visual imagination. And actually, there's an interesting point there, I guess, because there's been these cases where psychedelics, particularly ayahuasca, open up. They cured what was it called? Congenital aphantasia. So the lack of ability to do visual imagery. A single dose of ayahuasca changed it changed someone's ability to engage with mental imagery. So it goes both. So there's both ways, I guess. Like some psychedelic methods can enable other methods.
Yeah, psychedelics. Well, I'm not exactly sure, but it stimulates your default network, right? Which
What,
is,
sorry?
Psychedelics stimulates your default network.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of complicated. I think probably the most kind of simple summary of those studies is that it kind of loosens up the structure, the internal structure of the default mode network.
Well, thanks for the talk.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah, I don't know how much I would read into the studies about the default mode network, because in most or maybe even all of these studies, the participants weren't really doing anything. They were just like tripping in whatever laboratory setting they needed to monitor their brain activity. So it's I think that's a little bit different situation, like than doing a task or like, interacting with your environment, as people often do, except on all but the highest dosage, like most ego dissolving of trips. Well, meditation is actually another good example where like you're focusing on inward and not interacting with the outside world.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually hadn't thought about it like that. My rough heuristic for thinking about the effects of psychedelics is they just turn the volume up on whatever you're doing. So if you're sitting in the lab doing nothing and getting your brains measured, then it'll turn the volume up on that.
Right. Yeah, and that's probably different from meditating. I mean, in both meditation and like sitting in the scanner on a psychedelic drug, you're doing nothing. But I think unless of course it's a trained meditator inside the scanner on psychedelics, then they might be doing something similar. But I think it's.
Yeah, there was this interesting study that showed that the difference between I think it was focused attention meditation and non-dual meditation. The focused increased the DMN TPN correlation, anti-correlation, and the non-dual decreased it. So that stood out to me as like a pretty safe result. I think that you could get that difference in effects between two kinds of meditation, and that's what you would expect as well. But yeah, I agree that like we should be very careful in drawing strong conclusions from the research.
Any other questions maybe for anyone that hasn't already asked some?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on the topic of visualization. I find it really interesting because I mean your brain is your sensory part of your brain is a GPU. Certainly the visual cortex is, you can argue, is more like a GPU than a CPU. So in the sense that you're activating that, like, yes, it's more GPU like, but then again, if you're like an athlete, like visualizing I used to swim competitively, so I'll just use that example. If you're visualizing like how you're going to swim your race, like that's kind of very linear. And I mean, I don't know if I'd call it analytical, but like you're thinking, like you're definitely thinking about it in terms of like, okay, it has a beginning and an end, and it's linear, and you're like going through it and visualizing like, okay, this is what I need to do at each stage, or at least that's how I would always approach it. But I never really did well competitively swimming, so like maybe that was part of the problem. That brings me to the question, like maybe that brings up the possibility that maybe just activating this GPU like representation is maybe actually more important than what is being represented.
Yeah, Yeah, that's a tricky case because the task being performed is as a like you're being measured on how well you can perform on a rule-based task,
Yeah, exactly.
right? So it's kind of an artificial case, but an important one to think about. So I think probably what's going on with the GPU there is that like I think this would be let's see if you agree. This would be a worse way of trying to do the same thing. Instead of visualizing it, you think, okay, like 5 meters down the track, what do I first see? Should I turn left or right? Okay, 10 meters down, should I turn left or right? Or, thinking of like that, kind of having that kind of linguistic representation of the track. That would, if you did that, you'd probably do worse than if you did the visualization.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, I guess for most athletics, you're not only visualizing, well, at least for swimming, definitely, would not only visualize, I think about my proprioception and like what it would feel like, the somatic.
Yeah. I think this is an example where words kind of fail us, right? So visualization here can be understood very broadly, where you're basically stimulating the whole proprioceptual, visual, even auditory experience. Prepare for it.
But yeah, that's an interesting idea that like you can, as long as your representation that you activate is more GPU-like, then you can even tap into that to attack, these more like linear problems, let's say.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, I found this radiologist online who discusses this. He said that, so a lot of radiology is following checklists and just doing rule-based analytics. But they get tired, they get emotional, and all these problems like ruin that rule-based performance. And he says that the practice of meditation helps enormously with that analytic task, right? And it makes a lot of sense. So you can use the GPU to help support the CPU performing its tasks.
Yeah, I never really thought about it that way before. Thanks.
Yeah, in fact, actually, now you got me thinking, like, when you're trying to do something careful, like logically reasoning or doing a radiology task, there's all this other stuff going on, right? You're thinking about, your children or your family or your finances, whatever's going on in your mind. That's all this stuff that you've got to process, right? And so if you could direct your GPU at like reducing the load of that stuff on the CPU, your CPU is going to perform better.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. I mean, we have quite a few people that I think are on that haven't asked any questions. So if you want, now is your time. Silent people. No, I think they want to stay silent.
That's okay.
All right. We're almost finished. Yeah, so thanks, Aidan, again. I think it was a very interesting talk, and I think we could all have listened for even longer. A lot of interesting concept. Is the psychocryptic thing? Is that your term, or did you get it from somewhere?
So I came up with it by myself, and as far as I can tell, no one's ever used it before.
I haven't heard it before, so it was it's an interesting term. I think it helps. I think it's really interesting, that part about how we normally kind of, the whole idea of a psychocryptic state that we normally are in, because there's infinite things that you're ignoring at any given time. I also like all the stuff about, of course, the sensors. In a way, like the Throng, was it called Throng quote? Was very
Throng, yeah.
It was very sensory. Again, going back to vision. It almost sounded like a quote out of a, like the people that do object recognition kind of vision, and how the stream, the visual stream kind of constructs the overall perception that we have of an object from its elementary properties that are, that on their own don't mean anything. So it was very interesting. But at one point you said something about physiology. You said that these methods seem to be, or all appear to be, like physiological, but you think that's not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a necessity. Why? What was the example of a situation where there's not a physiological alteration.
Yeah, so these are the two examples I gave at the end of engaging with myth and aesthetic experience.
But for example, aesthetic, both of them are, I feel like they do have a maybe more than physical, maybe sensory component. I would call it, but
yeah, that's okay, because that would make sense. That would be tapping into the GPU again. Right. But the thing that I wanted to highlight was like, so a lot of these things like yoga, dance, sensory deprivation, consuming substances, fasting, these are all kind of substantial interventions on the body. And even meditation is, I think, because you're sitting for prolonged periods of time and resisting the urge to move and perform actions. Meditation is probably less so, but I think it's pretty still physiological. And compare that to sitting down and doing like calculations with probabilities. It's still, you're moving your hand or whatever to like with your pen, but it's much less physiological than fasting or consuming a substance. And so I think it's an important point to notice that it's not what defines these methods is that they're in some like substantial intervention on the body. So if you sat down and read Homer's Odyssey and really like visualized and engaged with it mentally, then I think you're using a psychedelic method, but you're not having a substantial impact on your body.
I agree, but I don't, on the part that on the second part, maybe not that much. I think you're still having a pretty substantial like, physiological, if you're engaging it in kind of the emotion, the way that I think you're describing, that still has a substantial kind of physiological alter. If you read a book and you're really involved and like you're really feeling like the whatever is, the feelings of the characters of what is going on, they can still be a pretty substantial physiological. But just
I agree with that.
There's probably a counterexample somewhere.
Maybe there's a difference between like the method and the effects. I mean, there's methods that are using the body, but what Marco's talking about seems more like that the effects could be physical or emotional.
Yeah, that seems right. There seems something very like, so if you eat a psychedelic, like you have to digest it, and those of us who are familiar with it, even that can be a process, just going through the like digesting a truffle, right? And then it has these chemical effects on the brain. That's very different from sitting down and reading a scientific article. It's much more physiological.
Yeah, but I think for me the distinction that really struck me, the distinction that you made was more between the more the analytic, let's say, is more kind of cognitive, higher cognitive functions, more prefrontal kind of functions, and the one that engage the more very quote unquote primitive parts of the brain, like the sensory, the motor, the subcortical aspects. I think that's really kind of a big distinction. And of course I do vision, so I'm very biased towards vision and towards how that plays into this. And I think that's very underplayed. That's very underestimated in a lot of the recent work.
Yeah, definitely.
But
that's why I wanted to include the myth and aesthetic experience to show that's what the distinction is. Exactly what you just said. Not like having this huge impact on the body.
Right. Any final questions before we end? We're good on time.
I would just like to thank, and I thought it was a great talk. Like, it really made me think. And thank you so much. I'm definitely look forward to. Well, I don't know. I'm leaving Amsterdam probably pretty soon, but like I'm looking. Well, whatever. I can still be part of opera. I'm looking forward to your book, and hopefully to coming to. If hopefully you'll do more journal clubs here, because this was really great.
Great. Thank you very much.